Story 1. The massive amount of advertising and upsells. As soon as you get on a plane back to the United States, it's all sign up for this credit card and watch these ads before and after the safety briefing, and you can pay later for all this. No payments today. It absolutely screams into your brain at every opportunity. Story 2. I lived in Russia for 18 months, which was over 10 years ago. When I came back to the United States, I spent a week in New York City and was taken aback at how nice everyone was and how poor the subway is. Story 3. Coming back to the United States from Cairo, it was relaxing not to need to be alert all the time. There is a lot to like about Cairo, but it is a tourist city, and many of the businesses and locals take advantage of the tourists. It's a little thing, but you have to be ready to argue vehemently about every price and service. I did not realize how much that was stressing me until I came home. Story 4. Returned to the United States from Korea. It gets talked about all the time, but just how unnecessarily complicated and inconvenient our healthcare system is. To go from a system where you can see a doctor or specialist any day of the week without an appointment, knowing you will be covered, and having the peace of mind that you'll probably spend less than $20, to then go to whatever we have here. It's just absurd to me. I also pay twice for my healthcare here than I did in Korea. We are so misled by a system that is openly robbing us and not keeping us well. Story 5. Returned to the United States from India. Sat down to eat at a restaurant at the airport, and the waiter immediately brought me a glass of ice water. Took me a moment to realize that this was safe to drink here. Story 6. Was floored by the massive portion sizes when I came back. Also, people are super chatty here compared to Germany. It felt weird at first, but now I kind of enjoy those random small talk moments with strangers. Story 7. I lived in Japan for a year. Coming back to the United States made me realize how dirty it is here, and people are lazy and disrespectful when it comes to taking care of the city and each other. In Japan, it's a collective effort. Public restrooms are clean. If you have trash, you put it in your pocket or purse and hold on to it until you can find access to a trash can. Here, people will drop it on the ground because they cannot dare to be inconvenienced. I've seen people at stoplights open their door and leave bags of McDonald's trash on the street and drive off so they can have a clean car. Of course, one of the first public restroom experiences when I came back home was in a store where there was a drainage grate in the floor and a woman had her kid urinating in the grates instead of the toilet. And don't get me started on how, if they even have the sniffles, they wear a mask in public to be courteous, but here people like to cough directly into the wind. Story 8. Flying from Shanghai back to Dallas was the biggest culture shock for me. Shanghai makes Dallas look like a ghost town, and the magnetic levitation train that runs over the city gives you a sense of scale like no other. Imagine being in a jet flying over a city that just seems to never end. Story 9. Pharmaceutical commercials on television were the most shocking. Smiling, happy people talking about taking a pill to counteract the pill they were taking for an issue. Side effects may include mass murder, jumping from bridges, and uncontrollable diarrhea. At least you'll be smiling while you deal with all the side effects. Story 10. After returning from living in India, I woke up parched one morning and realized that I didn't have any bottled water in the house. I got distressed because it was early, and stores weren't open, and it was cold and dark. Imagine my joy when I remembered I had potable water flowing into my house. Story 11. Moved from Singapore, then back to the United States. 3 biggest shocks. 1. Unlike Singapore, I can't expect everyone to know English in California. An American striking up a random conversation is normal. Mexican food is the most American food around. Story 12. After living in Korea and Japan, I will always appreciate the independence and individualism of American culture. Especially in Korea, it felt like I joined a gang or cult when I realized even the simplest tasks required the consensus of the entire office. I saw a 46-year-old feel like he didn't have enough authority to put paper in the printer, so we had to wait and ask the office superior hours later. It's hard to describe in a small post. I just feel like there's a certain kind of autonomy that exists here that doesn't exist over there, especially with regards to work. Story 13. The difference in how the food affected my whole body in a positive way after being away from the United States for almost 2 years. My wife and I both had physical withdrawals when we arrived in South America from the difference in the food for at least the first 2 weeks. Could not figure it out at first until our bodies adjusted. Both immediately lost weight without trying, and our whole physical appearance changed for the entire duration in a very positive way. Never felt so good in my life. After a few months back in the United States, it all came back no matter how good we tried to eat. It was very eye-opening, to say the least. Edit typo. Story 14. How everywhere in the world has to pay attention to what happens in the United States, but people in the United States do not have a clue about anywhere else. I doubt 1 in 100 could name the president of Mexico, for instance. Story 15. Having to drive everywhere. Dublin isn't the most bike-friendly place, but living there for several years and being able to hop on my bike and get across town in 20 minutes is something I will always miss. After being back in Illinois for 2 years, I still hate that I have to drive 2 miles to Target because that's the only option for getting there and home in one piece. Edited to add. At no point did I say I live in Chicago. I don't have city public transit and resources, thus my comment. Story 16. Had a layover in Salt Lake City on my way home from living in China for 6 months. How did all these people get permission to have so many children? Oh, right. Story 17. Coming back from Italy, the biggest shock was definitely the portion sizes and just how much more friendly people are in casual interactions. Also, driving everywhere felt so strange after being used to walking or taking public transport. Took a while to adjust back. Story 18. Something I realized back in the 2000s when talking to people was that the general education was on a lower level than, say, that of most European countries. Even things like college, which people pride themselves on, I often found the foundations in understanding can be a bit detached and rudimentary in the United States compared with Europe. I left the United States as a kid in the 1980s, and when I started schooling at around 5 years old in another country in Europe, I was reading a book a day and writing endless pages of flowing cursive and shorthand script to get in as much deliberation and information as possible to the teachers, as that was usually what's expected of kids back then. I compare my schooling to some of my relatives who remained in the United States, and it's like they never learned how to read or write very well despite being able to get a college degree. I found that when people are trying to read aloud, it seems like they aren't reading as much as trying to decode the letter combinations in real time, so they stumble over the words repeatedly as if some foundational line of code was deleted by accident. They also don't seem to understand basic things like geography and natural systems such as the water cycle, the interactions of the different types of resources in an economy, and so on. It seems like a lot of people just think that there's an infinite amount of resources and space out there, so there are fewer concerns around things like resource and waste management. I think most of that comes from a low regard for schooling and intellectual activity in general, despite being willing to toss a lot of money into the system. Then there's also homeschooling and religious schooling in the mix. The very individualist nature of the country allows people to live entirely detached from the rest of society and remain very shielded inside their own bubble. Oftentimes, when talking with a stranger, you can't expect there to be a shared sense of reality, leading to a lot of situations where what's considered normal behavior would elsewhere in the world be thought of as a rare occurrence of someone who's escaped a mental institution. Also, the kind of arrogance that comes with a culture of empire makes people overly confident in their situation and abilities, which is reminiscent of Britain and their colonial attitudes before the disintegration. What you'll actually find is that a lot of people will just crumble in the face of novel situations and difficulties, and so it's not the case anymore that there are a lot of brave and inventive or educated people out there who will take on any sort of new challenge. Part of that could be remedied if people were actually able to learn what's going on in other places in the world and not just project their assumptions upon everything they see. Instead, it's a case of people shadowboxing with these assumptions and keeping running into walls where it actually clashes with reality. I think that's going to be the main issue in the future, which is that the expertise may not be there to keep the United States running as it has been. A lot of early science education in particular was catapulted in response to the Soviet space and military program. My family initially worked in the early computer industry on the west coast of the United States, which was a byproduct of a lot of research connected to that, before we happened to settle down in Europe because of a job opportunity due to having experience in these new industries and fields. Story 19. The food. I lived in Canada from 2006 to 2014. You don't really notice it going the other way, but coming back, everything is loaded with salt and sugar. It is jarring. I gained over 20 pounds my first year back. I get that people do not want to hear this because we all love our dinosaur nuggets and cheap frozen pizza. But they really are trying to kill us with our food. At the very least, they do not care if they kill us as long as the profit margins are high. Related to that, the sheer number of truly obese people, kids in particular. I lived in Toronto, and it was incredibly rare to see a person who clearly weighed over 300 pounds, like maybe once a year. Coming back, it was just shocking how big the average American had become. I pretty much lay that at the feet of the food thing. Story 20. Central air conditioning. Outside of places like more affluent or developed Middle Eastern countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Israel and Kuwait or Singapore, air conditioning is an absolute luxury. Many people in the United States do not appreciate how good our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning capabilities are. Story 21. I lived in South Korea for a few years. When I returned to my hometown, St. Louis, very little had changed. You cannot walk anywhere in St. Louis County, and for the first time, that fact really got to me. My friends were also very sedentary and incurious, not wanting to go anywhere. I would go to a friend's house and they just wanted to watch Netflix, and I was so used to being a very active person. Lastly, when anyone asked me about Korea, they could not help but slip in a racist joke or two. I had changed overseas, but my hometown did not. Story 22. Coming back from Norway, I was shocked at how little paid time off Americans get. I had to readjust to the whole living to work mentality instead of working to live. It still bugs me. Story 23. Getting yelled at and herded around like cattle by United States Customs and Immigration as soon as I arrived back home. It's a huge shock to see how everyone with even an ounce of authority in the United States acts after being abroad where you're treated like a human. Story 24. Not being able to just go to the doctor when you feel sick or notice something wrong. In Taiwan, you just go to the hospital, pay a $6 registration fee, tell the registrar what ails you, get sent to whichever department fits your symptoms, wait for an hour or so, and see a doctor. Government healthcare. Absolutely. It's not communism, Americans. Story 25. Tipping. I lived abroad for a while, and on my first day back in the United States, I just genuinely forgot to tip a bartender on a single beer, and she told people at the bar that I stiffed her. Such a ridiculous system. Story 26. Coming back to the United States after living in Japan for 7 years. Everyone seems so angry and selfish all the time. Public places like parks, streets, and restrooms are just a disgusting mess that no one takes care of. Also, groceries were super cheap and fresh. I could get a week's worth of groceries for a family of 3 for around 10,000 yen. That's not possible in the United States. Story 27. I grew up in the United States but have spent my whole adult life in the United Kingdom and Austria. There are so many unique or nearly unique things about the United States. Everything in the United States is huge. I'm in the United States this week and just visited a friend in Chicago. She was apologizing for a cramped flat, but it was palatial by middle-class Western European standards. The only thing we've got on Americans in that department is super high ceilings. It applies to food too, of course. I just saw a pack of Reese's cups at Target that was more than a meter high. Diabolical. Lots of stuff is super sweet when it shouldn't be. Coffee, bread, and sauces. It's kind of icky once you start noticing it. Especially in Austria, shops and offices have very limited hours by comparison. I forget this sometimes and find myself planning around not being able to get anything on Sundays or after about 7 p.m. Tip culture as it is in the States wouldn't be tolerated in Austria. The United Kingdom is slightly closer to the American model, but not much. They're quite forward in asking for it. It should of course be given, but it ought to be presented like a choice, in my opinion. No gun signs on business doors. That's a stark reminder when you've been away. This probably runs counter to the common narrative, but I find lots of Americans are quite rude, in that they're not really aware of other people around them. Flying in this week, I was shocked by the fact that people just splay their stuff out on an escalator and block the path. You're supposed to stand on the right side and leave the left lane open for people in a hurry. There's also stuff like playing music out loud on buses and trains. This happens everywhere but seems more common in the United States. The amount of space given over to cars. There are so many parking garages. It's a ridiculous waste of space, and they're invariably ugly as sin. We have them in Europe, but not as many, and at least in the big cities, they're generally subterranean.